In this episode of the Sigma Empath Podcast, we're going to have a deep conversation about God, theology and philosophy, and the meaning and purpose of forgiveness. I'd like to welcome my next guest to this episode of the Sigma Empath Podcast. Tell us who you are and what you do.
My name is Father Stephen. I'm a priest in the Church of England, here in England, and I've just started a new job, so I'm all enthusiastic and raring to go.
Beautiful. Steve, I want to give the viewers a little bit of background. I've known you for the most part of over 40 plus years. Back to the days when I lived in England in the English foster care system. You weren't a priest in those days. You were social worker, not my social worker, but you were a social worker to one of the kids in the home. And I just want to start by a preemptive expression of deep gratitude for the influence you've had on my life and the lives of many children. I've watched you devoted to being a good human being. You're a priest. You said Church of England. Is that the same as Protestant? Is that a denomination that is?
Started from a controversial point. I mean, the Church of England is famously Catholic and Reformed. So it is part of the Universal Catholic Church. But it is reformed on the basis of things that happened in the Reformation, unsurprisingly. And so we're not formally aligned with the Roman Catholic Church, but our roots are in exactly the same place. And within the Church of England, there is quite a wide spectrum of people, from those that identify themselves pretty much with a more Protestant perspective, and those, including myself, who identify with the more Catholic perspective. So if somebody asked me, I would say I'm a Catholic Anglican.
Catholic Anglican. You talked about the Protestant faith. From what I remember from my English history, Martin Luther, 1517, the Reformation. Basically, he's a monk and philosopher who separates somewhat the Catholic Church. And then there's Henry VIII, of course, who adds to that. Can you break down and give us maybe the simple version of what separates Catholicism with Protestantism with Anglicanism?
Well, that is a very complicated series of questions, actually, and very controversial, disputed. Different people would take a different view, I guess. But the weird thing about the Anglican Church is that it has continuity and difference. So the continuity is very much in the structures of the Church of England. We have what are called the threefold ministry of deacons, priests, and bishops, exactly the same as you'll find in the Roman Catholic Church. We recognize the sacramental life of the Church. Those of us in the more Catholic bit of the Anglican Church would recognize 7 sacraments, the same 7 sacraments that are recognized in the Roman Catholic Church. And in many ways, probably most people would not be that aware of a difference between the Catholic end of Anglicanism and the Roman Catholic Church. On the other hand, Luther and other reformers of the time had some pretty important critiques to make of the way in which the medieval Catholic Church had developed over, obviously by then, 1,500 years. And I don't think there are even many Roman Catholics who would say that there was nothing to criticize. There was no reformation required. And there are certain particular things which created a disjuncture, if you like. One of them was the whole idea of the sale of indulgences, that it is possible to somehow, in one way or another, buy yourself into a better place after death by basically paying money to the church. And I think that there are not many Roman Catholic theologians who would say, yeah, that was right. We were right on the button there. So I think there are a number of things that started to happen in the medieval, over a long period of time, but came to a sort of a head in the late medieval period and the beginning of the Enlightenment period, which where the reformers were saying that some of the things have gone so badly wrong, if you like, with the way in which the Christian faith has become distorted by its association with particular kinds of politics, particular kinds of power, and that change was needed. And of course, the Reformation was a splitting between Catholicism and Protestantism, but long before that, 500 or 600 years before that, was the great split, what's called the Great Schism, between the Western Catholic Church and the Eastern Catholic Church, which are now called Orthodox churches.
Russian Orthodox and things like
Russian
that.
Orthodox, Ukrainian Orthodox, almost every, and this is quite important actually, almost every nationality in Eastern Europe and in the East, beyond that, has a national Orthodox church. And so the way in which Orthodoxy has kind of been in lockstep with the political structures of the time is another, has created its own issues. So you now see we have the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and the Russian Orthodox Church diametrically opposed one to another because of the war in Ukraine. So, so many things in religious history are extremely problematic, and they're the kind of things that I know you repeatedly have brought to the attention of the world, as it were. I think that a mature, I like to think of myself as a mature Christian, I certainly mature in age, if nothing else, would recognise that the history of the Christian faith is a history which is blemished, putting it mildly, you might say is almost destroyed by its historical associations with bad things, bad actors and bad results. But I suppose what the kind of demarcation, if you like, between somebody who's inside the church and somebody who's a critic, is making a critique of the church, someone like yourself, is where do you see two things really? Where do you see the balance, both historically and in the contemporary world, between those things which I'd like to think most people would accept are good about the Christian faith, and those things which are problematic, and whether the problematic nature is so kind of unavoidable, if you like, that it actually undercuts the whole thing and makes it, useless. I think that is a matter of choice.
I was raised very Catholic. I did have challenges with the so-called problematic situations of the Catholic Church, going back to its outdated medieval circumstances to some more modern practices. It brought me great value in some capacity. I neither believe or disbelieve. I want that to be clear. I'm not anti-God, anti-religion. I'm open to yes and no. I embrace both beliefs. On that topic, you've brought up the different creeds and different religious factions, Russian Orthodox, other Orthodox churches, the Church of England, Protestantism, Catholicism, all under the umbrella of the same God. Explaining God is a very complex thing to try and do. I would love your experience, your interpretation, how you view God and how you communicate your message to your parish, to your people, so to speak.
Yes. Well, I think, and this is a broad brush answer, I accept that, but I think that the way in which you understand God and one's relationship to God depends in large measure on how you got there in the first place. And for those of us who are cradle Christians, I was brought up, my father was a priest, brought up in the faith, then in a way that I've not ever had a conversion experience because I've never been not a Christian. You might say, well, how do you know you're a Christian when you're 4 years old? But culturally, I've never been anything but a Christian. There were long periods in my life when I thought it was all bollocks, and actually, strangely, ironically, when I knew you best.
Is that an official Anglican term?
Well, it's I would hasten to add, it's not an official Anglican word, but it's one of mine. For good, for better or worse. And when we met, I was very much in a phase of it's all, I was on your side of that demarcation, if you like. I acknowledge my roots and my indebtedness to the cultural milieu, if you like, in which I been formed. But I felt that the kind of distortions of that were so serious, so severe, and so unavoidable that the net result of it was that it completely blew the whole thing out of the water for me.
Yeah.
But even that has not given me this sense of a conversion experience of moving from here to there. That simply meant that I became more able to reconcile the dangers and inadequacies and distortions of Christian faith with the fact that that doesn't make the faith itself, doesn't actually question faith in itself. It just questions the implementation of that. So, and that's similar to many people taking a political view, that the fact that, for example, and I say this cautiously in a podcast that's going out in the United States amongst other people, those people who many people might say that the idea of communism, that at the root of that idea of sharing, of looking after one another, of making sure that nobody gets so far ahead of other people that you end up with all those tensions and distortions in society, that's not it's not a bad thing. And yet we can see historically how appallingly badly that was implemented, and how it became so distorted that effectively those values were lost. And indeed, they were absolutely trodden underfoot by the implementation of communism by Stalin and all those sorts of things and other places.
I think you've given me an aha moment, because that really sums up where I stand. I'm not against God or the belief in God. I think my challenge is the way it's been implemented, which is very different. And I'm glad you brought that up, because that brings me clarity. But going from your journey where you said you were raised already very Christian.
Yep.
You got into social work. One could say that's God's work. You're there to help kids, in particular these dysfunctional kids, at-risk youth, as they would be called here in America, me being one of them, in a home. You make this commitment to elevate and provide safe places for the underprivileged, so to speak. But then you continue that work, and then you become a priest. What is that emotional, spiritual, intellectual moment where you decide, I've done some great work, but now I'm going to dedicate and commit my life to a belief system under God, and I'm going to do everything that I can to promote this message? How does that happen? Why did that happen?
Well, I mean, I guess I must have told you about this at some point in my life. But when I first left university, when I was 20 years old, so 50 years ago, I was going to become a priest at that point. And I had got myself a place at Theological College in Oxford, and I was all ready to do it. They'd accepted me as what was called an ordinand, somebody who's going to be a priest. And they simply said to me that, you cannot go from school to university to Theological College and then to becoming a vicar without ever having done anything else. And so you must spend at least 1 year in the real world, which is a slightly strange expression, because I don't know how many unreal worlds there are, but and I, because I had to fill in that time, I went to work on an adventure playground in southeast London, and then I was basically sacked from that job because a young person came and knocked on my door one very wet November night, having run away from a secure unit in West London, and saying, "Can I come in?" And I said, "Well, you can come in now, but we go straight to your mother in the morning, because you can't, it's not legally okay for me to have you in it, but I'm not going to put you out in the rain." So I let him come and sleep on the floor. And obviously then I did what I said I would do, which is take him to his mother's house. But, it's hard to do these things completely without anybody knowing, as it were. And the police were obviously wanted to know where he had spent that night, when he was on the run, technically speaking. And I guess, they never came and asked me directly, because by the time they came to question me, they already knew about it. And I don't really know how that happened, to be honest. But the fact of the matter is I was interviewed under caution by the police. And, working for a local authority, and I was young. I think Bakery thought, well, he's a bit too hot to handle, this guy. So
it is a bit
they let me go. They let me go. Sorry.
But I was going to say, having been raised in childcare filled with bureaucracy and regulations and limitations and stipulations, understand the need for all these restrictions and rigidness, but sometimes, unfortunately, it defies the bigger picture. And for me, I think this applies across the board in any capacity. Implement common sense to the situation in the context of what was going on, in the interest of that child, his well-being, his safety. What is the best decision to make? And I'm on your side, and I know.
Thank you so much. And I was never arrested. I was never prosecuted, so you could say that they understood that and they didn't pursue it. But the local authority didn't like the idea of having had somebody, sail that close to the wind. Anyway, and I'm only telling you this because then I went off to Scotland and I worked for a couple of years there. And I went back to the church to say, I think I'm doing something which is quite useful already. Can I delay this training for a year? And they said, yes, but only one more year, because I'd already delayed it by 1 year by then. And at the end of that third year, I went back to them and I said, actually, I'm not going to do it. And I just focused on my youth work, and I got qualified, and then the rest is history. And then in 2008, and I can't tell you in absolute kind of forensic detail how this happened, but I began I went back to church because I hadn't been going to church for really quite many years. I went back and I began to think about what I had not done. And somewhere inside of my kind of deepest motivations and commitments, I suppose, I had never lost this original sense of calling, if you like. And so I think it is, it's something that you feel that, it's not language I would use, but there are people who say, God never lets you go. And, it doesn't, I don't like that way of speaking, but I can understand what people mean when they say that. And I think that there was a sense in which I felt, I need to do this now. I've put it off. This 1 year that I had to spend in the real world became 40. And now is the time maybe to do what I had already intended to do many, many years before.
That moment when you become, is it ordained? Do you become ordained? That moment, I've seen pictures. I was not able to attend. I don't think we were connected in any capacity. We lost contact. Social media brought us back together. I saw pictures, absolutely amazing, emotional, touching, proud, all those things. What was that moment like for you when you have now been officially declared as a priest, a vicar, a whatever that title is?
Well, it was extraordinary. But I think there was a sense of kind of completing something which had been unfinished, I think, and of arriving at a place that, at a place where that arrival had been long, long delayed. So it's that sense of finally, I've reached this place that I had set out to reach so many years ago. But I did not do that with any sense of regret about the fact that I hadn't done it 40 years before. It wasn't the kind of, I should have done this years. I'm so hacked off that I didn't, and I wasted my life. I didn't feel like at all. I didn't sort of turn my back on what I'd been and what I'd done. But this does feel like a kind of almost a sort of logical completion, as well as a spiritual and emotional completion. It's like, you've created this sort of big jigsaw puzzle of your life, and the piece that was missing was this piece.
It's interesting because a lot of people are looking for meaning, looking for purpose. And I quickly reference Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. One of the key factors that kept him going is that he found a very profound sense of purpose to wake up every day be optimistic, be positive, share that optimism, keep others alive. And it's elusive to a lot of people who live an entire life without purpose, which is fine for them. I'm a firm believer in purpose. It empowers us to do amazing things and overcome amazing things. Again, going back to that moment, you align with this sense of I've delayed it. This is what I'm meant to be doing. It feels right. There's no regret.
Yep.
Was it a level of relief? Finally, I'm doing and I know it's not regret, but was there a level of relief, or was it just simply moving forward? I am now going to do what I was meant to be doing, and I'm at peace with that. This is the right time.
Yes, I don't think relief is quite the right word, although I know what you're getting at by using that word. I think it's more a sense of completion than of relief. So it's the things that I've done up to this point were not wasted, but they didn't have. I suppose I now have a sense that they have been completed in what I'm now doing. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely.
And you know, there's also a bit more practical thing as well. Hey, if I don't do it now, I ain't never going to do it. So there is a kind of practicality to all these things, and we can all get a bit too highfalutin up our own backsides in terms of all the deep and meaningfulness of it all. I'd like to think there is some depth and meaning, but there are other things, practical things as well. You know, that come into the decision making. I'd be lying if I said I didn't sometimes think, well, what it would have been like if I'd done this when I was 25, which is what my intention was, Would I be a bishop? Would I be famous?
Could be famous, but probably you gained life knowledge, life wisdom, additional resources that prepared you. Now you are a wiser, much mature man, and probably you are now in alignment. You are ready to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I tell you what, when you talk about relief, there is a part of me which is relieved that I didn't do it then, because I don't think I'd have been any good. I think I'm a much better priest than I could ever have been if I'd been a priest from 25.
Tell me more about that. What do you think makes you now a better priest than you might have been 25 years ago?
I think that to answer that question fully, we maybe don't have time to do that, but when I first felt this sense of wanting to be a priest, this was the 1970s. Yeah, there was a mega thing in those days called the death of God theology. Where some theologians were really questioning not the existence of God, because we've had this conversation before. In a very technical sense, God does not exist, because things that exist are the things that God created. God himself is not a created thing, and therefore he doesn't exist. I'm glad
I'm sitting down for that piece of out there philosophically expressed, because there's so much truth, but it's truth, but it doesn't make sense, but it does.
But exactly so. The kind of priest that I thought I was going to be 24 or 40 years ago was some sort of, I don't know, a kind of guerrilla, kind of somewhere cross between a guerrilla fighter with an AK-47 and a dog collar. This sort of idea that what was really needed was radical change, and if it had to be violent, then it had to be violent. Such is life, and we were all going to be. That was what I was going to do, I don't think that anymore, and I'm very glad. I'm relieved that I was never given the opportunity to make an ass of myself to such an extent when I would have done. So when you said I'm a more mature person, then obviously that is true physically, but it's also true emotionally and mentally. And yeah, I would have been a very dangerous priest, I think.
Wow. I don't agree with you. I think you would have been a fantastic priest, simply because I know the body of your work. I know the essence of your character over the course of 40 plus years. So I doubt it, but this is, you better than me.
Yeah.
And it's great self-awareness to sort of admit this potential dark side of who you might have been back then.
Yeah.
In terms of religion, again, I was raised very Catholic. I became very anti-Catholic, but I do honor and respect that being raised in a Catholic environment brought me great value, even if it was a question of discipline and rigidness and humility and some of the more typical religious virtues. You now as a priest, twofold. What value has God brought to you throughout your life? And maybe more importantly, as a priest, as a vicar, what value does it bring to your community? Is it tangible? Do you see the value? So those question A and question B. What value has it brought to you? What value does it bring to your community, your parish?
I can only answer that question in the terms that make some sort of sense to me. And I'd just like to preface what I'm about to say, if you like, by saying I'm making no claim that this is the only way these values can be obtained or kind of pursued. So I'm not making an exclusive argument here. But I think what I'm saying, I guess, is that if you were to say to me, what one thing marks out me as a Christian person, or maybe as a person of faith more broadly, I would say it is that I do live my life, and I try to live my life in what I would call the perspective of eternity. By which I mean, I'm not really here talking about time in the normal sense of the word, yeah, like for eternity being a bloody long time. That's not quite what I mean. I mean, eternity, if you like, is something which is outside time. Time is not part of it. Yeah, that makes sense. But the way in which it translates into this physical world in which we are placed is that it enables me to think about things which, in a way, which transcend me and my time on this earth. Yeah, and I think that this is I guess priests would say something like this, and it might be interpreted as being sort of snooty and judgmental. But I think that the problem with modernity, and the strength of what you've criticized as medievalism, yeah, is that in those days everybody lived in this sense of eternity because they didn't have the means to live in this much narrower way in which we tend to live now, I think. Yeah, and that a lot of the things which are thought of as virtues, I think, are really potentially, at least not maybe dangerous is too strong a word, but are problematic. So self-fulfillment. Well, the first word tells you about why that's potentially a problematic thing. We're obsessed with ourselves. We're obsessed with our own personal development. We're obsessed with it's easy to mock, but things like people, those young women particularly, who on Instagram constantly or TikTok, whatever it is, preening themselves, sometimes taking real risks with their health. I sometimes see people with lips that I don't understand why you can't look in the mirror and see your lips look ridiculous. Their Botox, it just looks awful. And I recognize that there's almost a kind of distorted vision of themselves. Yeah. This attempt to perfect you physically and bodily, and this self-obsession, if you like, I think that is a real problem in society, if you like. Historically a problem.
If people were more connected to God, more spiritually, lived more Christ-like, would there be an inclination for less of this self-absorption?
Well, I mean,
but philosophically,
I'd like to think the answer to that is yes. Of course, there's no guarantee of that, but and there's always dangers when people start quoting things of the Bible, because you choose the bits you like and you ignore the bits you don't. That's the danger. But there are certain kinds of sayings of Jesus. If you want to be important, you must be a servant. If you want to find your life, you must lose it. So there are certain perspectives, if you like, within proper Christianity, which doesn't mean, of course, that the people who are Christians are immune to all the temptations of bigging themselves up and hypocrisy and all that kind of stuff. Of course we're not. But at least I think you can say that authentic, genuine Christianity includes specifically this idea that our fulfillment is found outside of our self-obsession. It's found in losing ourselves. You want to find yourself, you must lose yourself. And it's very hard for people to understand.
I don't subscribe or deny all these beliefs. I'm open to the philosophy behind what you're saying. We are complete alignment. I consider myself a relatively decent human being, empathetic soul. I like to think that I'm kind, sincere, all those beautiful things. And I don't feel that I've needed God to be those things. And I know that for some people, they need God to become those things. And so where I'm kind of going with this question, and it's not to debate, it's just to understand your perception. I have my, but I want you to express.
Sure. Okay. Well, I think that I do think it's possible, and there will be many my Christian brothers and sisters who say that I'm talking absolute, heresy here. But I think it is perfectly possible to have this perspective of eternity without having very much of a concept of God. Yeah, because I think that the way in which the Christian faith has developed is, there's a very, sorry, I don't want to get too technical about this, but the very core of the Christian faith is this madness, if you want, this madness, which is that a single human being, one man, can also be God, the creator and sustainer of the entire universe. Now, if that's not mad, what is? And the thing which follows from that is, if you want to see God, look at Jesus. That's all we've got. Yeah. You can't see, in the Bible, it says very clearly, St. John says, no one has ever seen God. And theologians throughout history, throughout the Christian era, have often been saying things like, there is nothing that you can know about God. God is unknowable. Yeah. And that's on the one hand. On the other hand, there's this whole notion of a personal relationship with God. Yes. But I believe that personal sense of personal, person-to-person relationship with God is only possible through Jesus. And it's only that idea that an individual person with whom one could have a personal relationship, that individual is God, enables you to say, I can have a personal relationship with God. Without Jesus, that's not possible.
But when you say the personal relationship via Jesus, are we now referring to him as God the Son, the Holy Trinity,
yes.
3 in 1?
We're talking about, we're saying this is the miracle of the incarnation.
Got it.
Pardon?
No,
yep. That's what we're saying. And that
the conduit to God.
I mean, look, theologians have been writing books, for hundreds of years, trying to get to a better, more adequate understanding of the Trinity, this fundamental thing inside Christianity, Christian faith. And, quite often, the more they write, the less they know. And the more we read, the less we know. Because by definition, these things aren't explicable or expressible in ordinary language. It's not possible. So everything, I think I've said this to you before, but I've certainly said to other people, that all language of faith is what I call as if language. It's as if this, as if that. Yeah. So, and one of my favorite phrases is, it's as if God exists. But for the reasons I've explained, in a microsecond, a little while ago, God doesn't exist. It's not possible for God to exist. God exists is a contradiction in terms, but it's almost as if it exists. And I think that one of my kind of guidelines in life, in the faith at least, is that the more certain people are, the less likely they are to be right. And I think that of myself. when I feel absolutely sure of something, that's when I start to question myself. Because knowledge is not given to us on this earth, not full knowledge. Yeah.
Well, the great Socrates once said, "The more I know, the more I realize I know nothing."
Of course, you're absolutely right, and you don't have to be a Christian to understand that. That's a fundamental, um, problem, if you like, of existence, of having consciousness.
Yeah.
Because I think, therefore I am. This is pretty much all we have. And so I think that when I just to rewind a little bit to this, what do I mean by the perspective of eternity? I mean, for me, that's we could spend forever trying to understand and explore that idea. But let me just give you one practical example. I was walking in a beautiful piece of parkland near Manchester a couple of years ago, because I lived there then, and this was the parkland of a great stately home that had since vanished. Yeah, but the park was still there. And I walked down this beautiful, stunningly beautiful avenue, double avenue of lime trees. And I walked down it at a time when it looked beautiful, because they were 300 years old. But when the people when they designed that park and planted those trees, they never saw that. They did that knowing they'd never see it. They didn't do it for themselves. They created beauty that they would never see. Now, who does that in the modern world?
I subscribe to that philosophy. There's another way of saying that. There's an expression, I believe it's Japanese, something to do on the premise that if you plant a tree knowing you will never experience its shade, you've understood life. So
there you go.
That's
the perspective of eternity. That's what I mean by that phrase.
You are doing this for the betterment of humanity. It's not a selfish act. It's a generous
or for its own sake. For its own sake, not even for the betterment of it. I think this is another way of expressing this idea of the perspective of eternity. Is that things have value in and of themselves, not because they're useful to us, not because we can make money out, not because they make us look good, not because they don't have use value outside of themselves. They are purely themselves. And I can spend, and my wife laughs at me and gets cross with me, I can spend half an hour watching an ant, because that ant, to me, has value of itself. It's an extraordinary thing, incredibly complicated, and obviously the community of ants is even more complicated. And I just think that's fucking amazing. Sorry, I'm not supposed to say that in America.
May God forgive you.
Well, I don't mind. God, it's the American people. I mean, they get terribly worried about swearing. I don't know why, but anyway. But
I'm okay with it. I'm not here to judge. One of the things I've always loved about you, Steve, is that in your progressiveness, you find a balance between you're traditional in some ways, but you're authentically you at the same time. And it's not easy to find that balance. So if the F word comes up, that's the way it was supposed to be.
Every now and again, I try to moderate it.
No, it's all about authentic expression. It's powerful. I want to end on the topic of forgiveness, but there are a couple of things that I want to quickly talk about before I do. Again, I'm going to give you credit. You've lived a very giving, caring, empathetic life. Empathy is my core message. You are a empathetic soul filled with kindness, understanding, forgiveness, generosity. You've made very key decisions in your life to commit to a calling. When that time comes, Steve, when your existence on this plane of life ends and you get to the metaphorical gates of heaven, and you're like, oh shit, God, you actually do exist. Remember that stuff I said back on earth where you actually, and you're like, oh my God, he does exist. What would you like this entity to say to you for the life that you've lived?
I suppose that you did more good than harm. That on balance. Yeah. you made the world a slightly better place and not a slightly worse place.
Wow.
Maybe that's quite a modest hope, but I know I'm not going to be lauded as, you've said some lovely things about me, and I'm not, I'm not trying to undercut them or pretend, thank you, and I really appreciate it. But your view of me is a lot more rosy than my view of myself.
Yes, that's because of your humility, which unto itself is
maybe.
another beautiful trait.
But I think that that's the best we can hope for is that, on the great deciding process of penalties, we scored more than we let in. Yeah.
So, still on the topic of the metaphorical pearly gates and heaven. Me, as I'm going to call myself agnostic, I don't really know what the term is for me. For those who are agnostic, for those who are atheists, same thing. We've gone through life. We've led a good life. We've done beautiful things. We've done some bad things. We've done predominantly beautiful things. And then I arrive at the gates of heaven and I'm like, this is some bullshit. I never believed in this guy. Oh, and then there he is. And then he looks at my review card and he says, you know what, Mr. Germain, you did some really good things. You did some nasty things, but you didn't believe in me. Am I condemned to hell or do I find salvation? Is it?
Well,
I was raised Catholic.
Yeah, I mean, you were taught very badly by some very bad Catholics, but I think that two things: one profound thing, one trivial thing about what we've just said here. The profound thing is that the danger you run, I think, if your emphasis is on I don't believe this or that or the other, is that when you get to those pearly gates, you won't see them. You won't have that sudden realization. Oh, they're real after all. They're only there. They're not there for you. If your kind of whole orientation of your perspective, this is why, this is the opposite of the perspective of eternity. This is the perspective of now and only now. Yeah. You won't see it. I mean, Pope Francis said that actually said, and I think he got a lot of flack for this, but he said hell doesn't exist. Hell is simply never knowing God.
Well, I mean, the concept of hell is Dante. I think it was Dante who sort of created this version of you will burn in hell and it's down below.
Well, he had all the 7 layers and all that stuff. Yeah, but I mean, he was living in a medieval time, and he was trying to say, but Dante didn't believe in those things as literal things. This was an analogy and a wonderful, extraordinary, creative way of trying to understand the perspective of eternity. What is the perspective of eternity? If you live this kind of life or that kind of life, what difference does it make in the end, ultimately? And that's what Dante was trying to explore in his books, in his poem. But I think that the only way that hell can be imposed on you is if you impose it on yourself.
Oof, wow.
Hell is a choice. Hell is a choice. Okay. And if you make the choice that no matter what evidence there might be, no matter what realization you might have, you are in principle never going to accept anything beyond yourself, because that is what I'm trying to say about the perspective of eternity. Yeah. Then your hell is the fact that you've got nothing but yourself. That's what you've got.
I will accept that. I will romantically say, though, for me, the non-believers, the atheist, for me, the important aspect is, are you a good human being? That's, for me, my heaven. Are you a good human being? But I want to move on to the topic of forgiveness.
Right.
Forgiveness is, I think, from my perception, is something that we're imposed to do for your own gain. It's letting go of something so that you're not carrying the burden of the shame and the guilt or the anger and the hurt, and it's more about releasing yourself than it is about the other person. I've tried to do that, and I live with a philosophy of some things cannot be forgiven. It's a very personal choice. I can move on and let go of the pain without forgiving the person, aka my father's sexual abuse. I didn't need to forgive him, and I was able to move on. Can you explain what forgiveness means for you on a personal level and its maybe religious connotation?
The first thing I would, I would just want to make absolutely crystal clear that I would never say to somebody who's had the experiences that you've had that they should do X or Y or Z about that. I've never had that experience, and I cannot begin to imagine the obstacles there might be to forgiveness if you have had those experiences. Yeah. I think that
but it's a common consensus that I hear from people who are either religiously enlightened, spiritually enlightened, who always say, but you need to forgive, you should forgive. And that's the part that, and I'm glad you understand that it's not a one size fits all, because that's where I'm coming from. But I want to get back.
It's not. But at one level, only you know if you need to forgive. Yeah. And in the sense where you've described it, is you don't need to forgive because you've got all the benefits of forgiving without doing the forgiving. Yeah. That's a bit of a unfair summary of what you said, but it's pretty much what you just said. Yep. I've moved on without bothering with the forgiveness part. And there are many people who say that they don't think you can move on like that, but you have. So there's the answer to them. They're not right in every case. Provided that, you have truly moved on. And I'm not asking about that. I'm just saying that, it's easy to say you moved on, but I suppose those people who talk about how can you move on without forgiving might be saying to you, the bit of you that hasn't moved on is the bit that didn't do the forgiving. I don't know. And I don't really want to get entangled with that. I'm just saying what they might say. But I think that you say that you started your bit about forgiveness about saying that people, forgiveness is supposed to be for the benefit of the forgiver rather than the forgiven. And I think that I think that forgiveness is for both for the forgiver and for the forgiven. And central to forgiveness, and this is an incredibly difficult thing to pick the bones out of, for sure. But I don't really believe in the existence of evil in the sense of that there are evil people that are evil for no reason other than that they're evil. Yeah. And so I suppose what I try to do, and it's not in the same ballpark as the things you're trying to forgive, and I don't want to suggest that it is, but what I try to do when I'm trying to be a person that can forgive is I try to understand what it might be that made the person that I'm forgiving do what they did.
Well, that part, the empath in me, the empathetic part of me, I can do that all day long without a problem. I understand that, for example, what my father did to me, what other abusers have done to their abusers, what sociopaths do to rats and children and dogs and animals. I understand it comes from a place where they must have been damaged, hurt, traumatized to an extent that they are perpetuating it and taking out on the world. That part I can empathize and understand.
So which is the bit you don't?
Well, because I can understand you did those things, but I'm still going to hold you accountable, and I still think you're an asshole. But I understand why you're an asshole.
Well, I don't think forgiveness is the same as opinion. You can forgive somebody and continue to think they're a complete asshole, or maybe they are. In fact, I'd be very hard put to forgive Trump for being an asshole. But the fact of the matter is, I guess even he is like he is for reasons which are to do with his experiences, his background, the things that happened to him, etc., etc., etc. Doesn't alter the fact he's a narcissist git. But that. Sorry, I'm getting this too political for you. But I think that forgiveness is not about letting off the hook. Forgiveness is not about pretending it never happened. Forgiveness is not saying, oh, it's all right. That's not what forgiveness is. Forgiveness is recognizing that the person who's been harmed and the person who's done the harm are still, despite everything, in it together because they're both human. We're in this mess, which is our inability to do the thing. Go back to the Bible for a moment. St. Paul said, the good things I want to do are not the things that I do, and the things I don't want to do are the things that I do. Our inability to be the people we want to be, to do the things that we know we should do. Yeah. That is the fundamental reason why forgiveness is an important thing, because we are, forgiveness as a sort of technical, religious, Christian concept, as opposed to a kind of secular concept that's borrowed the idea from faith. But in terms of faith, forgiveness is about recognizing that we are all in need of it. Yeah, there's nothing. I know there are things in which I have not. Things not necessarily things that I've done, but things that I've felt, things that I've said, things that I've not done anything about that I should. There are an infinite number of things that I didn't do or didn't get right, and may well be hurt people in ways that I don't even know or understand in my life.
In terms of forgiveness, Steve, this is one aspect that I think is undermined, overlooked. We always focus about forgiving somebody else. And I don't think people focus enough on forgiving themselves for being human. And
absolutely,
that's a big part of my messaging, in particular for people who are empaths, highly sensitive, incredibly kind, people-pleasing people who are abused and taken advantage of, is there's this level of shame and guilt. Children who have been abused become adults with self-loathing, and they take on the responsibility and the blame and the shame. And I wish that society would also promote forgiveness for the self more so than forgiveness of others. But
when it's done properly, and it very rarely is, but when it's done as it should be done, the sacrament of reconciliation or confession is exactly that. It is, using religious language, which obviously doesn't speak to you, but
no, Steve, it does. Again,
the last words.
But I'm not against religion.
The last words.
It's implemented sometimes.
Sure, and I understand that. But I suppose when I'm talking about specifically here is the use of God language in a very kind of matter of fact way, which for you I think is quite problematic.
No, it's not. That's why
I'm wrong. It's not a problem.
Because I have this discussion with you because it is a different perspective, a different philosophy that I'm open to. There's great value in what you believe in and what you do, and I'm focusing on that value rather than our discrepancies. I'm all about embracing that which is different to my beliefs. So is why, for me, this is really important to me to have these types of discussions, because it opens my mind. It allows people to also consider different perspectives. And again, the objective is if we can minimize our differences and find commonality, that's the ultimate objective, Steve. Where do we find commonality?
Well, by talking and by having these kinds of discussions. Right. But I think that, just to go back to what I was going to say, when it's done properly and done well, the sacrament of reconciliation, sacrament of the confessional, the last words which the priest will say is, God has released you from your sins. Go and sin no more, which is a reference to what Jesus said to the woman taken in adultery. Go and sin no more. And then after that, he says, to the person who's on the receiving, inverted commas, end of this process, the priest says, go and pray for me, a sinner. Confession, the sacrament of confession is a mutual thing. It's not the priest sort of making a judgment about whether you're, it's not about the priest at all. The priest is a conduit. The priest is is the embodiment, if you like, in this particular moment, in this instance, of Jesus of God. We say in Latin, in persona Christi. A good priest is in the person of Christ. And if they're really good, they know that they're not. They are and they're not simultaneously. Yeah. That to be in the person of Christ is not to be Christ. I am not. And often I say it's a classic thing. People say, how many kids have you baptized? And I say, none. I've never baptized a child. God baptizes. I go through the process which enables that to happen. Now, I'm being a bit picky there, and I know what people mean when they say how many kids you baptized, but it's important as a priest always to remember that anything that I do as a priest, I'm allowing God, Jesus, the divine to do through me. I'm not doing it of my own volition for myself, or I'm not creating this opportunity. I'm delivering it, which is different.
Steve, what an honor. What a pleasure. One, to reconnect with. Again, I'm going to give you some credit here, because in your humility, and I've said to you this before, we recently reconnected in London. We
it was lovely.
Dinner together. It was fantastic. Something that I want you to remind you of is the value you've brought to me. And I remember in the home, the value you brought to so many kids. Life-changing. You are one of my heroes, one of my mentors, who potentially kept me alive in some capacity. I don't want to get over dramatic, but your influence, not through what you say, your influence through how you show up, through what you do, color aside, on or off, the essence of your character is God-like in the way you interpret God. I want to thank you for the impact you've had on me. I want to thank you for the impact you've had on people you don't even know you've had an impact on. And thank you for taking the time to express your insights. Whether we agree or not is secondary. I wanted you to share your expertise, your knowledge, your wisdom with myself, with my community. Thank you. And I forgive you. I have trouble.
Well, I need it desperately. So
I forgive you for having a different opinion. But there you go.
I'm pleased to hear that. But Vita, look, thank you. You said some lovely things, and I'm very grateful. And you live your life the best you can, and it's for others to make the judgments. So,
beautiful.
Well, thank you for yours.
Thank you, Steve. I look forward to our next conversation when I get back to England, or you come back out to the United States.
Yes, if I'm allowed.